Good morning or good afternoon, tigers. Again, I feel like I always start these videos apologizing, but I still have my groggy, sick voice. But it's better to record what I'm going to remind you of today and not run the risk of losing my voice instead of, me talking all day and then for me to lose my voice fifth and sixth block. So this is why I made this video. I'm not going to make videos all the time. This is just because I might be losing my voice. Anyways, I'm going to review a little bit of what we've been doing. So let's say we have a question that's like -2 plus j is greater than -16. So the first thing we do is we isolate the variable, we circle it, and we try to get rid of everything outside of the circle. What's outside the circle is this -2 right here. So we have to do the additive inverse. So let me get my correct pointer. There we go. We have to do the additive inverse of -2. So what's the inverse of -2? +2. And what I do on one side, I do to the other. You guys are all pros at this by now. So -2 plus 2 becomes 0, but I still have this j left over is greater than -14. Then when I graph that, I plot -14. Here's the bigger question. Is this going to be an open circle or a closed circle? It's going to be open because this does not have an equal sign on the bottom. So remember, if there's an equal sign on the bottom of the inequality, the circle is closed. But if it does not have an equal sign on the bottom, the circle is open. So this circle is open. Now we have to decide in what direction we're going to shade. So if you look at this inequality, the arrow is pointing in the right direction. So when I shade, I'm going to shade in the right direction. Okay, obviously when you guys shade, you don't have to do it this colored or this pigmented. You get the point with just one little line in what direction it's going. So this is the graphic solution to our inequality. Moving on. Now, I want to teach you how to solve an inequality that has a negative coefficient on the variable. So let's say we have -2 plus -j, again, is greater than -16. So I'm still going to isolate the variable. And I'm going to do the inverse of -2, which is +2. So same step so far. This turns into 0. I still have this -j left is greater than -16 plus 2 is -14. Now I want to get rid of this negative on the j. In front of every letter, there's an invisible number, and that number is the number 1. So -1 is being multiplied to j. What is the opposite of multiplying by -1? So again, the opposite of multiplying by -1. Remember, multiplication, the inverse of multiplication is division. The inverse of adding is subtracting. So right now I'm asking you, what's the inverse of multiplying by -1? Multiplying, so what's the inverse? Dividing. So now I'm going to divide by -1. And what I do on one side, I do to the other. -1 goes into -1 one time. But I'm just left over with j. Now when you divide, here's the rule. When you divide or multiply by a negative number, the inequality flips. So this inequality flips to the other direction when I divide or multiply by a negative number. Now this is another rule you have to remember. A negative divided by a negative. Remember, when there's an even amount of negatives, what happens? Even amount of negatives. That means that your answer turns into positive. So a negative divided by a negative is positive. 1 goes into 14 times. Now when you graph this, you have a graph that looks something like this. Here's 14. Is my solution going to be open or closed? Remember, if it doesn't have an equal sign on the bottom, the solution is open. So my solution is open. And in what direction is the arrow pointing? To the left. So I'm going to shade to the left. And there's my solution. So I know there was a lot in this. We're going to do 2 more examples, and hopefully you guys get the hang of it to practice on your own. So now let's suppose you have an example that's a little bit more complex. You see a negative number, then you see subtraction, and then you have the inequality with the number. Do not be intimidated by this. Follow the same steps. Isolate the variable. This time, since it has a subtraction in front of it, you need to keep the subtraction with it. Or you can say there's no such thing as subtraction. Subtraction of a positive number is the same as adding a negative number. Or you can say something like subtraction can be changed to addition of the opposite. So what's the opposite of positive x? Negative x. Either way, the x is going to be negative. We're not worried about that right now. Right now what we're worried with is this negative 2. So what is the inverse of subtracting by 2? What's the inverse of negative 2? Adding by 2. What I do on one side, I do to the other. Negative 2 plus 2 is 0, so you can cross that out, and what are you left with? Negative x. So negative x. The inequality stays the same because I haven't divided or multiplied by a negative number. 7 plus 2 is 9. Now, what's the invisible number that's in front of this x right here? Remember I just taught you that? It's 1. What is the opposite of multiplying by negative 1? Dividing by negative 1. What I do on one side, I do to the other. I divided by a negative number, so my inequality has to flip in the opposite direction. Remember, this is not as difficult as it seems. Once you practice, they're a lot easier. I don't know if you were here yesterday or not, but this was actually my favorite part when I did inequalities, because I could remember this rule. When you multiply or divide by a negative number, the inequality flips. Okay, back to our example. Negative 1 divided by negative 1 is just 1, but I'm going to write x. And my inequalities switch from less than or equal to greater than or equal to. Negative divided into a positive is still negative, because remember, when you have an even amount of negatives, that means that the answer is going to be negative. So 1 goes into 9 times. So it's negative 9. Now if I graph this, I'm going to plot, oh look, I was already making a mistake here. So this is positive 9, this is 0, and this is negative 9. Is my solution going to be open or closed? Remember, if you have an equal sign on the bottom, it's a closed solution. So it's a dotted circle. So it's closed solution. Closed solution. And in what direction is my arrow pointing? To the right. So I'm going to shade everything to the right. There you go. So those are all the possible solutions to this inequality. So the last example is, let's say you have something that looks like this. Let's say we have negative x over 5 is greater than 3. This negative right here, when you have one negative, it can be on the x or it can be on the 5. Let's put it on the 5. So instead of having the negative on the x, let's put it on the 5. Okay? So now this x is not negative. This x is now just positive. So what is the opposite of dividing by negative 5? Dividing by negative 5. What's the opposite? Multiplying by negative 5. And what I do on one side, I do to the other. Since I multiplied by a negative number, what happens to my inequality? Remember, it flips. Okay? Because I multiplied by a negative number. This negative 5 and this negative 5, it cancels out. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be this. Do you see that? Negative 5 goes into negative 5 one time, so you're just left with x. Negative 5 times 3 is negative 15. And now, when I graph it, it's going to be like this. Negative 15, here's 0. Is my solution going to be open or closed? Open, because it doesn't have an equal sign. Open. And what direction is my arrow pointing? To the left. So I'm going to shade everything to the left. Okay, hopefully this helped you. Good luck on your assignment. Try your very best. And if you absolutely don't know what you're doing, raise your hand and wait patiently for someone to help you. Have a nice day.